And so I put together a presentation that I will be walking through. And I know this meeting has no official time limit, but I do hope that maybe we can wrap this up after about an hour 15, hour and a half tops. So without that further ado, I'll start sharing my screen and go through our presentation here. So, okay, I think I need to share that screen there. And okay, let me know if you're seeing my title slide, AADC. Okay, I see Tim nodding. So, okay, yep. So anyway, once again, yeah, that I'm Chris P, chair of the Archives Committee, and about Alcoholics Anonymous in our nation's capital. So our story begins where pretty much where AA began with Fitz M, author of Our Southern Friend, and who is referred to in the chapter We Agnostics. Uh, as somebody who's lived in Mississippi for 11 years, the idea that Maryland is the South is a little bit it gives me a little bit of a chuckle. As Cleveland as a certain Western city also kind of gives me a chuckle. But anyway, so Fitz lived in a little community that actually no longer exists called Cumberstone, Maryland. It's right off the Chesapeake Bay, south of Annapolis, a little bit. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Maryland, Baltimore is exactly 25 miles straight north, and DC is 25 miles straight west. Now, we do know that Fitz was trying to carry the message for sure to Baltimore, because there's a 1936 letter that Fitz had written to Bill about a Baltimore doctor who recommended somebody who was actually living in New York City that Bill might want to reach out to. But what he was doing in DC at this time, we really don't know. We know, Fitz went up to New York fairly frequently, and so a lot of his uh, talking with Bill was probably along the line, probably on phone calls, and so we might not have too terribly many letters on what was going on. But things come into a little clearer focus in the summer of 1938. And if you recall, at this time, AA was trying to get money. We were still in the phase of thinking that we were going to have paid missionaries and all of these sanitariums and drunk farms. And Bill and Fitz, in the summer of 1938, toured the country, or at least the East Coast, trying to raise money, and that got people talking, that eventually connected Bill and Fitz to a DC police court judge named Walter Casey. And Casey was one of the four judges that oversaw the police courts and had a whole lot of drunks coming through his court. And what the idea was is that they could establish an AA drunk farm at the Occoquan workhouse. Now, the workhouse was the jail for drunk offenders. It was, people would be sentenced there anywhere from a couple days to maybe a month or so, depending on if they're repeat offenders, so on and so forth, with the idea that Fitz, our Southern friend, would be the administrator of this hospital, and he really needed the work. Going through the last few pages of our Southern friend, Fitz really struggled in early sobriety. And if you ever get a chance, it's to visit the workhouse. It's now the Workhouse Arts Center in just north of Occoquan, Virginia. It's now got art galleries and even a little museum there that talks about the workhouse's history. Um, it's really a neat place to go visit. But in any case, by October of 1938, the drunk farm idea was dead. There just wasn't. A drunk farm for DC had been proposed since the 1920s, off and on. It had a lot of popular support, a lot of support even on Capitol Hill, which, being that the DC is a federal district and not a state, something at the city level had to go through Congress, and that's not too easy to do. Um, but so Bill and Fitz decided that if they did more work on the ground in DC, they might convince city officials to finally cough up the money to get this drunk farm going. But also, they needed to show the Alcoholic Foundation, the donors and the board, that more was being done outside of New York and Akron. And so at this time in 1938, even the Alcoholic Foundation was saying, we really don't want to try to raise a whole bunch more money for you because we need to see a little bit more results. And if we see results, then maybe we can get more money. But also, Fitz, living 25 miles away, needed some help to carry the message in DC. And so we don't know for certain whether or not this is why Florence enters the picture. And Florence moved to DC sometime between November of 1938 and February of 1939. Now, Florence, we know her from her story in the first edition called A Feminine Victory, which outlines, her being the only lady alcoholic and looking for a supporting cast of her own sex to share her sober life with her. Um, Otherwise, we don't know whether or not Florence had any ties to DC. We don't know, why DC, why Florence. We just don't know. Now, what's also interesting, and maybe this is more just kind of a hopeful fantasy on my part, is that in A Vision for You, when Bill writes about an alcoholic who moved to a large city, as of a few days ago, as of this writing, and found that there were more alcoholics per square mile than anywhere else, even though Bill refers to this person as a man, Florence moved to DC right about the time A Vision for You was being written. So could, that person have been Florence talking about DC? We don't know, until until correspondence, shows up. We just don't know. But in any case, Florence did move to DC. And Florence had a lasting impact on AA that she's the one who insisted the big book not be titled 100 Men. And she was the first woman to get sober in 1937 and accumulate significant sober time. Obviously there were attempts to get women into the program that didn't go so well. Um, Her story was the only story by a woman in the first edition. And no other, as far as I know, no other stories by women were added until 1955 with the second edition. So, readers of the big book, female readers of the big book, had only one story by a woman for 16 years. But very little's known about what she did in DC. But we can connect some dots. So about a year ago, I came across this article. Mary Hayworth was a advice columnist for the Washington Post, and she later, or right about this time, I guess, got syndicated into 200 or 300 papers across the country. But at the time, she was serving the local DC population. And in February 13th, 1939, and this is still 2 months before the big book came out, Hayworth published this letter about a woman that abandons her drunken husband and leaves young children. And it's interesting to compare this letter to A Feminine Victory because apparently they're referring to Florence in this. Now, the letter was probably cooked up. There probably was, I think it was Worried Neighbor who signed this letter. Um, but, Hayworth did cook up letters every now and then just to get something to respond to in her column. But she mentions that she is told that there is a small a small group of former alcoholics aligned in a casual, informal fellowship in DC, and basically describes AA without noting it. So somebody had to tell Mary Hayworth that AA existed and that AA was in town, and then at the time, there was something called the Washington Institute of Mental Hygiene, which is how people would get in touch with AA. But we don't have any correspondence. We have no proof that Florence was talking with Mary Hayworth. And it could have been Fitz, or it could have been Bill in New York reaching out directly. I mean, we don't know for certain, but the timing certainly adds up. Now, in June 1st of 1939, Hayworth published another article in which she names Alcoholics Anonymous, but talks about an acquaintance of mine who had an illuminating spiritual experience, and that this woman is affiliated with Alcoholics Anonymous. So, being that Florence was there at the time in DC at the time, and probably had some contact with Mary Hayworth, certainly could be Florence that Mary Hayworth is talking about here. Now, it's possible that she's talking about Marty M., who was sober only about a couple weeks up in New York at this time. So we don't know for certain that Florence is the woman referred to in the article here, but a whole lot of things add up. And then in November, now the big book came out in April of 1939, and Hayworth provided a book review of the big book, and tried to promote it a little bit. And in class says it is definitely not to be classified as quack literature. And as some of you might know, the medical community didn't think too highly of the big book at the time. Most of our support, came from other sectors, came from other places. And certainly people in the press were enthusiastic about AA. But Florence's story doesn't have a particularly happy ending. So Fitz moved to DC permanently in October of 1939. It's all but certain that his marriage was falling apart at this time, and he did get divorced from his first wife in 1941. But Fitz arrived in DC and wrote a letter to Bill saying Florence is not in evidence, and that Florence had been uh, running around with a guy significantly younger than her who kept her drunk. And one day, this boyfriend in Florence put a woman on a train, and Florence never returned. And she ran out on her rent, which was about a month's worth of rent at the time. But that's pretty much where she leaves Alcoholics Anonymous. In 1954, Bill W. did say that Florence was overwhelmed with the work in Washington. Now, the Pass It On book says that Florence died of apparent suicide, and this isn't true. In 1983, the Archives Committee found Florence's death certificate and found that she had died from meningitis, bacterial meningitis, and had a couple other health problems. She'd been in the hospital for a couple days, and so the idea that she had committed suicide in her home or anything like that just doesn't really match up with what was on the death certificate, which, of course, death certificates were often, uh, you know, uh, I don't want to say faked, but the cause of death was sometimes not reported accurately, but there's no evidence that it was actually suicide. Now, her grave remained unmarked until 2007, and the Archives Committee for the DC Intergroup found where her grave was, and individuals, not the Intergroup and not AA groups, individuals donated money to get a headstone. And I really need to go and clean off the headstone so you can read it better. But the top of her headstone is the title of her story, A Feminine Victory. So at least there's a little bit of a touching end what turned out to be uh, a pretty unhappy story of one of the first women in AA, which left Fitz by himself in DC. Now, Fitz lived in this gorgeous graystone row house in DC. At the time, though, it was a boarding house known as the Gatewood that had kind of middle of the road rent per month. And he was receiving referrals from the DC office that were mailed to him. And one of his first people responded right away, a guy by the name of Hardin, which we'll talk about in a little bit here. And so, through Fitz's work with the hospitals, there was a spin dry clinic called the Green Hill Institute here in town at the time. And the Washington group started to form around Fitz's efforts. So, the original core group is often referred to first as Fitz, our Southern friend, then Hardin C., who was Fitz's first 12-step referral in DC, or at least after he moved there. He was probably 12-stepping people before then. There is also George S., who was a brigadier general who would go on to have a distinctive career in World War II. And no, this is not George S. Patton. It is George S., different last name. An interesting fellow known as Bill E., which we'll touch on him again in a few minutes. And then a gentleman by the name of Steve M., who in 1941 moved to Atlanta and got AA started down there. And then finally Ned F., who was a New York transplant who uh, came to DC in very late, about December of 1939. But there were other early members. One of them was Bill A., who lived into the mid 70s and was very active in AA in this area, particularly across the river in Northern Virginia. And and he's an interesting fellow as well, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But at first, he thought the Washington group was too rinky-dink to keep somebody like him sober. And this guy had more money than anybody and didn't mind pushing people around with his money. But he traveled to New York weekly to go meet with Bill, just because he said, yeah, these little, these ruffians in DC, I need something a little bit stronger. Um, Now there's Bob E., which we'll hear some sound clips from Bob E. in throughout this. And he was a longtime DC member. He died about 1990, and we got good recordings and good interviews with him with some really interesting stuff. There was a woman named Dorothy H., as well as some people who get fairly infrequent mentions in the early correspondence. A guy named George E., somebody named Rosie. We don't have a first name for him, just a nickname. A gentleman named Louis G., Harold W., who was active in the local group, and when the Washington Evening Star published an article about AA's meeting with John D. Rockefeller, said, you got a couple things wrong, and so appears in the newspapers there. And then one old guy named Dick T., who Fitz found him just about freezing to death on a park bench in DC, and 12 stepped him there, and Dick T. was still sober as of the early 70s. The first meetings in DC were held in Hardin's home, which is in the ultra fashionable Calorama area, which so Calorama, Barack Obama moved to Calorama after he left the White House in 2017, just a few blocks from where Hardin's house is. And right at the same time President Obama was living there, Ivanka Trump and Jared Kushner were living about a mile, about a block away from the Obamas. So pretty high-end part of town. But they also met in other people's homes. So Agnes M. is Fitz's sister. And some of you may be familiar that Agnes loaned AA $1,000 in order to help get the big book written. And and everything. And Fitz said in one of his letters that Agnes has been very, very generous coming home to an apartment filled with tobacco smoke from the after the meeting. They met in the home of Louis G. And Fitz said, which should be interesting, but he didn't say why an AA meeting at Louis G.'s house would be interesting. And then I mentioned Bill E. a little bit ago. Now, what's so interesting about Bill E., is that some of the old timers said that he was an Oxford grouper from the DC Oxford group. We know very little about the DC Oxford group. Usually, when they show up, it's because Frank Buckman was giving a speech or something like that. We don't know very much about what was going on the day-to-day, week-to-week for the Oxford group. But I did find a 1950 newspaper article saying he'd been sober for 13 years, which would have put him getting sober in 1937. But and he lived until the late 50s, remained active in AA, but we know very, very little about who Bill E. was and whether or not a 1937 Dayton Oxford group connection is accurate for him. But they couldn't, just as the big book talks about, the home would no longer accommodate this group. DC needed to start having public meetings. And George S., the general that I talked about earlier, is reported to have said, to hell with opposition, this city needs meetings. And what that opposition was, we don't know. But AA meetings, as we understand them today, were new. They were brand new. The big book doesn't even talk about the type of meetings that we have today. Um, so maybe some people weren't too happy about leaving people's homes and being in public. So, but we don't know any details to that. But in any case, the very first public meeting of AA in DC was held on Thursday, March 21st of 1940, and it was at the Veterans of Foreign Wars Hall on 1700 L Street on the corner with 17th. It was the uh, Veterans of Foreign Wars Hall that had a little restaurant downstairs, and then the meeting rooms were upstairs. Now, on these recordings, we did a little technology test. The recordings come across very quiet, unfortunately, and so they're captioned. So you may have to read these and turn your volume up pretty high in order to hear them. And none of the clips I have in here are more than a minute long. So yeah, don't worry, I'm not going to have you listen to somebody for 40 minutes. But so Bob E., he wasn't present at the very first public meeting. He got sober about 2 or 3 weeks afterward, but he described in 1988 at a speaker meeting what the first meetings were like.
Way down there, there was an old building, 17th and L, where the Veterans of Foreign Wars Hall. It was just an old brick house. I guess they just rented it. I doubt if they owned it. And you went in on the ground floor, there was sort of like a lounge area, and they had a little bar. You went around the side of this bar and up the steps. I thought it can't be all bad. At least these boys have a sense of humor. And he got upstairs to a little meeting hall, about 1/4 as big as this, I'd say, or less. And maybe there were 20 people there. I don't remember that much. And about half of them probably were having problems, and the other half were wives or husbands or brothers or whatever. And some fellow was up front, and he opened up and he told, not very different from what we do today, he told what AA was all about, a little bit of it, and told a little bit of his problem, and then he turned it out into the group, and it just passed along like we do in our closed meetings.
So that was what some of the very first meetings in DC were like. Now, overall has the Cleveland Plain Dealer, it has Liberty Magazine, and of course it has the Saturday Evening Post article that came out in 1941. Washington, D.C. had the Washington Sunday Star. And on May 5th, the district got its first in-depth introduction to AA. where a reporter named Robert Irwin, which by the way is not the Bob E that you just heard from. It's just coincidence that there's two Bob E's, but Bob Irwin was a non-alcoholic reporter who visited the Washington Group a couple times and was so impressed that he wrote this 7-column article on the bottom of the front page of the Sunday Washington, D.C. paper. And it took him a while to write it because he wanted to get it just right. But the AA members were like, "Okay, come on, Bob, you got to get this thing published. People need to know about us." And so this came out in early May. And in 1954, Bob Irwin uh, talked about how the article came about. And so Irwin, as a reporter, had done a feature article on a psychiatrist known as Dr. Mendelsohn, who was also non-alcoholic, but psychiatrist in DC. And and Mendelsohn connected Irwin to AA.
Well, time passed on, and one day, and that was a day that I will remember throughout my life. Phone rang. Bob, I said, "Yeah, Doc, how you doing?" He says, "Say, Bob, I've got a swell feature for you." He was practicing over here on High Street then. "I got a swell feature story for you." I said, "What's that, Doc?" He said, "Alcoholics Anonymous." And I said, "For Pete's sake, Doc, what is anonymous about an alcoholic?"
So So Bob did realize that he had his work cut out for him, but the article was a success. Fitz wrote to Bill the next day saying that he'd been answering the telephone all day or calling on it in response to the local reaction to the article. And the plan was that they would have about 500 reprints of the article written up and mailed out. Well, one of the calls he got was from Bob Irwin saying that his editor had approved a series of 4 or 5 articles that would appear in the near future. And in actuality, 6 articles finally came out throughout the month of June in 1940. And further, went into some details about how AA works with the clergy, how medicine looks at AA, and several other aspects. And Bill replied that within just a couple days of the article, they had about a dozen inquiries to the New York Foundation office, all mentioning the article. So it was getting the results that they had hoped. But at the same time, there was a notable omission from the article. The article didn't say anything about how to get in touch with AA, and that caused some problems for the reporter Bob Irwin.
Out by I don't know how many people. And so they didn't know where to find the AA, so they decided to call Bob Irwin. The phone would begin to ring. Sometimes it'd be 2 o'clock in the morning. Said, "Is this Mr. Irwin of the Evening Star?" "Yes, it is." "Well, where can I find Alcoholics Anonymous? My husband's in pretty bad shape." Next time it'd be, "How do I get in touch with the AAs?" Well, that went on, and it was just like practicing medicine. And that would go on night after night, week after week for months.
Yeah, we sometimes ask quite a bit of our friends with their phone ringing with people looking for us. Um, and at the time, AA was meeting at different locations around the city. And so other locations during the spring and summer is the Burlington Hotel, which has since been torn down, but the Hamilton Hotel is still there. A couple people mentioned meetings at the Mayflower, but we can't confirm whether or not that happened. Uh, but also the YWCA comes up a couple times, and so it's entirely possible that we may have had 1 or 2 meetings at the Mayflower or the YWCA. But so far, I haven't found any concrete documentation of that. And but the hotel meetings didn't last too terribly long, and Bob E., again, not Bob Irwin, but Bob E., the alcoholic, tells us why.
Sort out, in a sense, and did not have come back. Well, we had had the Skid Row boys wandering in through the lobby, see, and they didn't go to sleep in the chairs. They wasn't too happy about it.
Yeah, so the Hamilton, which has heads of state and various other people of note staying there, might not have liked some of the people that AA reached out to going to sleep in the chairs in the lobby. Um, so, in order to avoid that problem, in October 1940, DC got its first clubhouse. It's since been torn down. I've been tearing up newspapers, and well, not physically tearing up newspapers, but looking through newspapers and the DC library trying to find a picture of the place before it was torn down. But it was not the swankiest of places in town. You had to enter through a back alley. It was downstairs through a dark hallway, and people said that there were frequently rats running around the hallway. And one person said it was even a former speakeasy back in the Prohibition days. And well, we can always find a speakeasy. That's one of our talents as alcoholics. But in a letter that the chair at the time wrote to New York, he said, "Well, at least it has two bathrooms, which solves that problem," which gives you an idea of what problem they had encountered at some of their other locations. Now, there were some women at early meetings. AA Histories, has a lot of mention that it took some time for women to become involved with AA. And so, in that March 1940 letter, where Fitz described to Bill the first DC public meeting, he mentioned that there were three new women Alkies who were good prospects. And he said, "Bring Marty along." And Marty, in this case, was for sure Marty M. But we don't know who Betty was. It might have been the wife of a non-alcoholic wife of an alcoholic, for all we know. Um, but there were other early women. So Dorothy H., she's the first DC woman that we have a name for. She served as the group secretary in the early part of 1940. Now there was Marge F., who lived almost to well into the 1990s, and she was very active in AA all the way through. Unfortunately, she didn't like to be interviewed, and so we don't have a whole lot of good information from her. And then the woman named Ruth B., who later worked at GSO and then later was active in Mississippi. And I believe she was even Mississippi's delegate for a while, which, when I lived in Mississippi, my sponsor was the delegate. And so it's kind of a neat little connection. What goes around comes around. Um, but Ruth B. in 1949, speaking in Nashville, provided her perspective on women involvement in the early meetings.
But even within the group itself.
Now, so one thing about women in DCAA is that particularly as World War II got underway, or we entered World War II, I guess I should say, um, DC has always had a higher than average proportion of women at the meetings. And part of that is the government workers that came in and all the female government workers that came in as part of the war effort. Now, 12-step calls in the early days were quite a bit different than the ones that we get today. And once again, Ruth B. provided some information on how the 12-step calls played out.
Well, we used to go out to the phone call and we'd go out really armed for battle. We always carried a pint of whiskey and a bottle of Peralahide and a whole bunch of pills. And we'd all rush out the door to see this poor brother or sister, whoever it might be. And if the poor guy or gal were in fairly good shape when we got there, we saw to it that they got worse rapidly because we were so anxious to impress them with the fact that we were not the temperance league, or that we were not there with any critical attitude, that we practically poured the whiskey down their neck. Then we gave them formaldehyde on top of it and passed them out, and nobody sat up with a drunk in those days. We left them unconscious.
So quite a bit different than we do things today. But 12-step calls could also be quite humbling, such as Fred G., who got sober in late 1940, early 1941, told us in 1988.
I learned this lesson in humility from this classmate of mine at St. Albans Prep School. When he called me up one time, he was a member of the Chevy Chase Methodist Church. And he said, Fred, one of our members' husband is in the hospital and he's an alcoholic. And would you go over with her to see him? So I said, sure, I'll go. So I went over with her, and here he was in bed, and I know just how he felt. His eyes were closed. And I said, well, I'll tell you, I know just how you feel. And I know you don't want to hear me, so I'm not going to say much. I'm not going to preach to you anything else. I just want to tell you that I know exactly what you're going through now, because I've been through it myself. And when you get well, and you will get over this, if I can be of any help to you, I'll be very glad to take you to AA, and then you could be sober and happy like me. And he opened one eye and he said, who wants to be like you ugly bastard?
Which sounds like something I might have said once upon a time, but in any case, we'll move on with how AA grew in Washington. And so in 1940, AA resumed its contact with the courts. And this news article appeared where AA was to get custody of a DC drunk to try a cure. So in the courtroom of Judge Walter Casey, if you remember him from 1938 and his work with Bill and Fitz, Bill A. stood up and said, hey, why don't you let me take this guy, take him home, straighten him out, and work on him there. And so in the newspaper article, it all sounds kind of nice and good and everything, but Bill A. at a talk in 1972 provides a little bit more colorful behind the scenes narrative of what happened.
To see my friend Judge Walter Casey. I said, why don't you turn one over to me and let's see what happens? It isn't going to cost you anything. At that time, 4 judges met the fight. So Bill Wilson left, and another fellow to the name of Fitzmail, and myself. We went over to see him. And these judges kind of looked at you really snarly, not a grin on their face. I have a feeling of blowing my stack when I know that. I said, I've been in one of you characters, and I'm not kidding. We'll put the money up. I'll get you $50 to 10. We'll do a damn sight better job than you characters have done. Give me a chance. You haven't even got guts enough to give us a chance.
And so that's how AA started its work with the courts in DC, with a little bit of browbeating by one of the one of the region's most successful businessmen, and actually very well connected political personality. There's pictures of him with presidential candidates and that sorts of thing in the local newspapers. Now, that story about the person who was released, the person that was released did stay sober and stayed sober until the early 70s. And we don't have enough time, but there's quite an interesting coda to that story there. But As we know, AA didn't always have the traditions. And so as a result, the Washington group didn't always follow the traditions. And such as in March 1940, back in when we were still trying to raise money from the big money interests, Fitz and George S. were hopeful that big businessmen would show up at that first meeting and hopefully, write AA some checks to do all of its stuff. But later on that year, Don S., who was the Washington Group chair at that time, was presenting at a community organization about concerned with alcohol, and there were some, prohibitionists that were there and some doctors. But he solicited the people there to submit names of friends, relatives, or acquaintances who are alcohol addicts so that AA can follow up with them and see if maybe they want to join in, which certainly is not attraction rather than promotion, to say the least. But also in the press, anonymity wasn't always too tightly observed, and such as this 1944 article. It was actually a series of articles that was written by an AA member using a pen name, but it included, pictures with identifiable faces, except for this guy on the right who had the foresight to physically tape pieces of paper to his forehead to obscure him from the cameras. So anonymity was there. We were trying to follow it, and we didn't always get it exactly right. And then in the 12 and 12, Bill talks about how he and Dr. Bob sent out a letter to all the AA groups saying, send us your membership rules. Well, DC had membership rules. And boy, we had a number of them. You couldn't come to AA if you were drinking. If you had a slip, you were kicked out for 30 days. If you missed 3 meetings, you were weeded out as an inactive member. And they would keep membership records and they would sign a sponsor to keep tab on you. And then the executive committee might decide to keep you. So, just as Bill said, if all these rules had been in place at once, nobody could have joined AA. Unfortunately, these rules didn't last a year. By July of 1942, they were repealed completely. And it says voted on by a large majority. Well, the one person who voted to keep them is Eddie Kay, the one who proposed a few of those rules. Now, you could say that, aha, but these aren't rules for AA, these are rules for the AA clubhouse. Well, you would be right, but at the time, there were no other groups anywhere nearby. The nearest AA to Washington, D.C. was in Baltimore. And beyond that, you had to go to Philadelphia or to Richmond. So if you were kicked out of the DC clubhouse, you were effectively kicked out of AA. If you showed up for a meeting, would they let you in? Don't know. But, fortunately, we saw the error of membership requirements and Tradition 3 developed. As we get into the mid 1940s, we see the establishment of neighborhood groups around the city. And it was recognized as early as 1944 when Harvey C., who I think was the treasurer of the Washington Group, I'd have to remember, he wrote to New York and said, hey, we're going to have to start decentralizing here in DC. We're just getting too big. And Bobby B., who was the foundation secretary at the time, wants the Uptown Group, who we'll talk about in a moment, uh, re, when that group was formed in 1944, said, yeah, that phase of AA is over where she and Bill W. could come and visit individual groups. There were just getting to be too many groups, and it just wasn't possible to, for the old relationships that the groups had with New York to continue. Now, of course, this didn't come with controversy. Probably one thing that we love to do as AA members is is discuss things and object to change. And Bobby once again described some of the concerns they had when the neighborhood group started.
We didn't really want them to start it, but they thought it would hurt downtown by the central group. And finally, they agreed that this would just be a neighborhood discussion group. They'd still come downtown and support downtown. And we carried on that way for quite a while until finally, it was a losing battle. Couldn't hold on downtown group. But we did feel that we lost the support. We could see the clubhouse going by the board. It all took money to run the clubhouse. And we handled all of the correspondence came to the working group. And we handled all the 12-step calls. And so in the beginning, we weren't too happy about it. Later on, we were all for it. And even the satellite group, Silver Springs, helped to start for as many as half a dozen groups at least.
So in the end, wisdom wins out as it always does. So that by the end of 1945, there were about 8 different groups that were meeting in the Washington, D.C. area. So there's the Silver Spring group, and then the Uptown group, which was the first of the satellite groups, later changed its name to Chevy Chase, and I think it later changed its name to Little Falls group or something like that. The Georgetown group started in 44, 45, as well as the Arlington group started in Arlington, Virginia. Now, the newspaper group was a daytime meeting that met at the press club, the National Press Club building, and was frequented by reporters from the news bureaus that would come down during their afternoons or their lunch breaks to take in a meeting. Now, the Southeast group was the first group east of the Anacostia River, and it started up in 44, had folded by about 47, then started up again in 49. And then, of course, we still had the Washington group, which about this time changed its name to the Central Group. And that was the group that, at the time, managed the clubhouse. And then finally, the Cosmopolitan Group, which I know we have several Cosmopolitan Group members on the call here, but that group is in the Big Book, particularly in Jim's story. In the story section in the AA Pioneers, where if you want to know more about Jim's story, go to a Big Book meeting that reads the stories. Haha. That's one way to convince you to get to meetings. But so Jim was born in Warrenton, Virginia, which is about a little over an hour, maybe an hour and a half from DC. Then came to DC, where a bunch of things happened to him. Now, so some of the places that are mentioned in Jim's story. So Jim mentions that he stabbed his wife V with a penknife on the corner of 8th and M Street. Well, that was just a bunch of row houses at the time, but it's now part of the convention center. So when you're here for the National Book Fair or, whatever professional society, when you're dodging traffic, running from one part of the building to another, that's where it happened. And Jim's wife, her name was pronounced V because her real name was Viola, and she lived until 2003 at the age of 101. And I know that Bill W. had interviewed her in the mid 1950s, shortly before AA Comes of Age came out and the St. Louis Convention. But it's a crying shame that we don't have better interviews with V before she passed. So, but the group that Jim refers to, at the time it was referred to as the colored group, sometimes rendered as the Negro group, but it changed its name to Cosmopolitan in 1946. And to this day, it continues to meet both in person and online. And as far as we know, it's the longest continuously active AA group in DC. Chevy Chase group might be slightly older. If that group has continued on, have to look a little bit more, maybe during the questions if somebody has info on that. But but the group's still there, and it's very well attended and a very fine group. But it wasn't the first black group, despite what the front part, the stuff in italics at Jim's story is. And it wasn't even the first black group in Washington, D.C. area. So Bob Irwin's 1940 article that we talked about a while ago mentions that there was a colored chapter started in Arlington, Virginia. And that was at a neighborhood called Hall's Hill, which today it's right where, if you're familiar with Arlington, it's where George Mason Drive crosses Washington Boulevard. And that group didn't survive. Probably didn't even last a year, from what I heard. But one of its members did. Albert L. attended that group in Arlington in 1940, and he stayed sober until his death in 1983. And we'll mention Albert again in a few more slides. And DC folks were involved with starting other early Black AA groups. In fact, it was just on Friday I found this newspaper clipping from the Atlanta Daily World talking about how a Black group was started in Atlanta. And together with national officers, I love how they termed it that, from Washington, together with officials from the White Atlanta branch. And I think that the two members from DC that were mentioned was Steve M., who had moved to Atlanta by this point and got AA going down there, and then a guy. His full name was Hugh Byron C. And when he lived in the DC area, and he was the archives chair in the mid 80s for the DC Intergroup, he went by Hugh. But I found that there's a letter from 1942, right about the time this group was started, where both of them are mentioned. And so it was probably them that they're referring to in the national officers from Washington and Atlanta. But as far as we know, this group also didn't survive. Now, this is the slide that might get me a little bit of static from DC members here, is whether as it was called at the time, the AA1 Negro group in St. Louis was older than Cosmopolitan. And there's still some feelings about this today. Now, this group, as far as I know, didn't survive, although Cosmopolitan did. And so in October, the Alcoholic Foundation wrote to Torrance S. in St. Louis, and it sounds that in October, um, the Alcoholic Foundation had just learned about the Cosmopolitan group. And St. Louis wrote back, Torrance wrote back saying that the group in St. Louis was started in January 1945. Now, we know that Jim S. in DC and Torrance S. in St. Louis wrote letters to each other, but we don't know what the letters said, unfortunately, because they haven't been found. And then when Jim wrote to New York, he said that Cosmopolitan was started in April of 1945. I know this question's been asked and answered many times, but it was kind of cool to see the letters laying out these groups' histories. Now, AA as an organization was never segregated. I actually get this question once in a while, and but segregated communities had segregated meetings, and the rules of the facility dictated access on who could attend functions at those locations. And so the YMCA that Jim mentions in Jim's story was the Black YMCA, and which operated separately from the white YMCA, which was about half a mile or so across town. And because DC clubhouses were rented spaces, the landlord set the policy. Now, Evelyn T., who was very active in a lot of the groups around here, and I know that she spoke up and down the East Coast, talks about her experiences coming from a non-segregated city to a segregated city.
Yes, I attended my first AA meeting in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 1948. And I have to explain this because in Philadelphia you went according to your neighborhood. And in 1948, there were not any blacks at the meeting or any women. Then I got to Washington in 1953, and unfortunately, the meetings in A were segregated. So, of course, since I was a woman of color, maybe you all didn't know that, it's a great objection to meetings being segregated. And I explained to them I didn't know a thing about drinking, didn't want to. But I told them, just drink with anybody, and so I don't see why we couldn't be, everybody come to the meetings and all. But the tact and diplomacy that most AA members have. And they said to me very nicely, well, Evan, you just stay, and when you get yourself together, you can integrate it. And you know what? I was dumb enough to believe that. And somewhere while I was sitting there, they integrated. Now, I don't know just when, but they did.
And so those of you who've had the privilege of knowing Evelyn or hearing her tapes know that she was a very entertaining speaker. And she didn't talk about the segregation very much. I believe this was an event hosted by the area that where this was specifically the topic. Now, Julius was a member of the Cosmopolitan Group, and he got sober in 1945 and stayed sober and active in AA. I'm not sure exactly when Julius died, but I think it was around 2000. And he talked about what happened when he showed up at a Washington Group meeting.
To the white group, they were meeting at 1360 Euclid Street. So I went up there, and here comes this bald-headed guy, walks over, and says, well, Judy, you know what the situation is here in Washington, said, you folks got a group that meets down to the YMCA. Jim Scott has got the meeting down there. I said, yeah, I'll go down there. I'm a member of that group. I came up here, I thought I might get some ideas to carry back to our group. So he said, okay, very good. So find your seat back there. So I just went on to the back room and sit down, and some youngsters were back there. They maybe comfortable. They want cookies. I said, yeah, so I got me a Coke and some cookies, and stayed there until the meeting was over.
And so, DC was officially segregated until the Brown decision, obviously, and but there were some ways around that. So in 1944, Bill A. Hired Elbert L. to make coffee at whites-only facilities hosting meetings. So even though Black members couldn't attend functions at whites-only facilities, it was well within the law and tradition that they could be employed there. And so local lore says that Elbert was paid like a dime or 25 cents or something to make coffee. And because if they ran out of coffee, they'd have to make more. And so Elbert was allowed to stay at the meetings and participate. And some groups were still listed as interracial in our meeting schedules until about 1963. And it's somewhat inaccurate to say that the Cosmopolitan Group was a Black group because everybody has always been welcome there. It's never been exclusively for Black participants or Black memberships. And with the end of formal segregation, as over time, as neighborhoods changed, the meetings changed. So, for example, the Metropolis Club was started in the mid 1960s. Almost all the members were white when it started. By the 1980s, because of the changes that took place during the city, its membership was almost all Black by the 1980s. Which the last group that I'll talk about is the meetings for Spanish speakers. And so in 1964, in our where and when, our meeting schedule, there was a Spanish American group that met, conducted in English. Leave it to alcoholics to have a Spanish AA meeting that's conducted in English. But in any case, that's what we had. And this group only lasted about a year. It folded in about 1965, which coincidentally is when Antonio E. arrived in DC. Now, Antonio was educated in the US and was bilingual in English. After he graduated college, went back to El Salvador, where he couldn't find a job and became a bottle a day drinker for about 10 years, he said. Well, as part of his effort to get sober, he moved in with his sister in DC in December of I don't know if it was December, but moved to DC in 1965 and got sober shortly thereafter. But Antonio was pretty much alone in DC, at least as far as Spanish speaking goes. And, if one thing has helped Washington, D.C. AA, it's been question and answer columns. And so the Washington Star in 1969, in their Sunday edition, had a Spanish page for Spanish customers. And in March of 1969, Antonio and the Washington Area Intergroup cooked up this letter and described how on Fridays from 7 to 10 p.m., the person answering the phone will speak Spanish. And that person obviously was Antonio. And Antonio provided some idea, some history on how Spanish AA in the district grew.
After a couple of years, they called me and say, "Hey, there is a guy that called Gonzalo E that wants to go to a meeting, but he doesn't speak any English." So I brought him to an English-speaking group, and a couple of months later, Amado Z came too. Same thing, no English. So I started taking them to meetings in English, and I used to translate for them. So, but after a while, I say, "Hey, that's no good. Why don't we start a group?" And we started a group, Latino Número Uno at the Metropolis Club. We figure out that if we start with telling our stories, after the third meeting, the group will break up. So we decided, hey, what we will do is just like the Americans do, step meetings. So one Saturday, step one, next Saturday, step two, and so forth and so on.
And so that was how the Spanish groups got started in DC, first with Antonio translating for people in the back, and then starting meetings that were dedicated to and conducted in Spanish. Now, in order to help reach more Spanish-speaking members in DC, at the time, WFAN, an FM radio station, was the local Spanish radio. And so Antonio and the group members found a way, thought that they might be able to advertise for AA or publicize AA on the radio. And Antonio tells us how that came about.
I returned it to the group and say, hey, it cannot be that we are only the three members of AA in the whole city of Washington. At that time, there were about 100,000 Spanish-speaking people. So how do we get in touch with them? And there was a Spanish-speaking radio. So I said, well, let's try that. And what we did, we went to the manager of the station and said, I have noticed that in Latin America, they had a program of AA that lasted half an hour, but no self-respecting alcoholic will listen to a program of half an hour. So the best way is to catch them with a 20-second ad, for example. We took the questions of the 12 questions, and we gave the number of WAIA. So we went to the manager of the station, and we say, hey, full of fear. So you can imagine somebody, hey, we are alcoholics. And the guy, hey. So we explained to him what an alcoholic was and what we were trying to do. And he said, I will help you out. For the 20-second ad, you can give me $2. So we all chip in. One day, they called me from Intergroup and say, hey, there's a guy, and he left his phone number. And then a couple more guys came, and so this group started. Still, we were three.
Now, that didn't solve the problem of what happens when a Spanish-speaking member calls the WAIA number and gets somebody who doesn't speak Spanish. Well, what they did is Antonio took a tape recorder and recorded himself giving his number in Spanish and instructing the caller to give him a call. Well, so when a Spanish speaker called, the phone volunteer would hit play on the tape recorder, hold the phone up to it, and so the message was communicated in Spanish. And that worked. And people started coming, and the Spanish groups grew. And in 1972, the Intergroup put this little help wanted notice in their newsletter that they were getting more calls from non-English speakers, and were uh, looking for more bilingual help on the phones. And the Spanish Intergroup in DC was started in 1973, and there were 5 Spanish groups by 1975. But some of these Spanish groups started over conflict in format. And Cesar F, tells us, what some of that conflict was.
But in that time, the immigrants started up to come over to DC more numerous. So some peoples who come from Central America, they start to come with their customs. And I recall that was a conflict between them and us, that the meetings were not handled in the same way because they were discussing very often about to have a podium in the meetings. So we used to have in the meetings 1 hour because that's what I learned. That was 1 hour every Saturdays. Then those guys who they come from Central America, they started up to fight the leadership on the group. We started up with the Grupo Latino, and that's a split. Grupo Latino dos splits. And we went to make meetings to my apartment. And they say, well, we cannot have meetings here. So one day we discuss and they get upset. And they say, well, we're going to go find a place to have meetings. They rent a room.
And so I sometimes get the question of where the 2-hour Spanish meetings came from. And so a lot of the Spanish-speaking AA in the United States is actually a re-export from Central America and Latin America, where people in the U.S. started meetings south of the border and throughout the Western Hemisphere. And then they had 2-hour podium speaker meetings in Latin America. And so when those people came up to the U.S., they wanted the same thing. But because Cesar and Antonio uh, had gotten sober in the United States, they were familiar with the US style of discussion meetings that lasted 1 hour. So anyway, that's interesting answer to a question that puzzled me for a while. So that brings us to the end of what I have time for here. Um, and in 2026, this city still needs meetings, but what we also need is to continue capturing our history. So one thing that I've noticed is that, our intergroup has roughly 1,000 speaker tapes from various speaker meetings and events and whatever. In the last 10 years, not very many. Last 25 years, we don't have too many. And it's somewhat ironic that everybody now has a recorder on their phone, but I'm not seeing quite as many speaker meetings being taped anymore, or events being taped. And so that's one thing I would encourage is anybody who is connected to a speaker meeting, maybe see if those tapes, if those meetings can be recorded, and if the speakers would consent to that. Which also brings up the idea, work with your archivist to preserve electronic files. We had a big heartbreak here in DC where about 2012 or so, the archivist at the time conducted just dozens and dozens of oral history interviews with people. They were all on his hard drive. And when this individual died, there went the recordings. So we have lost just hours and hours of our oral history because at the time we didn't know how to preserve electronic files like we did with paper. One thing I've gotten a big kick out of is going through old grapevines. And now that the grapevine's searchable, I can find articles from DC people who wrote in and talked about what their groups were like throughout A's history. Don't interview just the old timers, particularly with COVID. I've interviewed some younger people who, didn't go to an in-person meeting for the first year they were sober. 20 years from now, that's the type of stuff that we're going to need to know about. And so if we can record that history now, so much the better. Also provide, your meeting minutes, your flyers and everything to your archivists. And if there's newsletters, read back issues and write articles and get involved. And I don't think this is something I have to tell this group about much, but anyway, just some ideas. And of course, keep coming back because we're going to need you. And the people who are coming long after us are going to need us as well. So that's the end of my slideshow. And so let me stop sharing here. And then I guess we can open it up. Like I said, I've probably got about 20 minutes for questions. Thank you, everybody, for the applauses I see popping up here. So, but
Okay, that's going to end the presentation now. Do we have any questions